Hey, everybody. Okay, y'all. Thanks for being here once again. We're going to be starting Hemingway today. So, notebooks out, and brains ready to go. Hope y'all received my list of French words, Hemingway words, theoretical words, and how to spell them. That should be in your Canvas accounts. I think I put that in under announcements. So do take a look at that. I want to start out with some biographical information. And now we won't always do that, but there are some of our figures that are particularly there's a particular connection between their biographical life, so to speak, and their work. And when that's the case, I'll emphasize their biographical life a little more thoroughly. And when it's not the case, I'll recede. And there'll be some couple of figures that I really don't mention much at all about their biographies. But in the case of Hemingway, I think it's important. So we'll spend today, we'll spend today talking about those some of those biographical details, and then also the issues raised by some of those biographical details. Some of which will be very self-evident, right? And we'll point this out as we go by. But there's also, you'll see a very clear linkage. There's sort of a lineage between the issues that we've been talking about up to this point in the course, and the young Hemingway. Hemingway was born in Oak Park, Illinois. You can go see his house; it's still standing in Oak Park. It's a beautiful part of a very affluent but beautiful part of Illinois, part of Chicago, Oak Park. He was born in 1899, so right at the edge of the 20th century, and he lived until 1961, death infamously by suicide. Pardon me, my allergies are acting up. In the spring of 1918, so we go into 1918 now. Hemingway's 18 years old, 19 years old. The U.S. had not entered the First World War yet. Okay, so Hemingway crosses the Atlantic to Paris on the Chicago. This is back before air travel was possible. Crosses to Paris on the Chicago in the spring of 1918. So the U.S. had not even entered the war yet. And the city of Paris is being shelled by the huge famous German gun called, I should say cannon, called Big Bertha. And there's this story of he's traveling with a friend, and they order a taxi to take them, quote unquote, to where the shells are falling, unquote. They take a taxi to where the city's being damaged by the shells. And he does volunteer work at first in Paris, and then he joins the Italian army. So he is the first American to enter into the war. And he's transferred to the Italian front, and he's an ambulance driver, which means he's shuttling the wounded to aid stations, but he's still a good distance from the actual fighting. Hemingway's biographer, Kenneth Lynn, Kenneth Lynn, His is the biography I would recommend. I have it right here. I'm going to do a quick reading from it. There's my copy. It's a great biography if you are interested in Hemingway. Let me just turn to page 76. Okay, so this is Hemingway talking about his experience as an ambulance driver on the Italian front. This is actually an excerpt from his great book, Death in the Afternoon. Regarding the sex of the dead, it is a fact that one becomes so accustomed to the sight of all the dead being men that the sight of a dead woman is quite shocking. I first saw the inversion of the usual sex of the dead after the explosion of a munition factory, which had been situated in the countryside near Milan, Italy. Pardon me. Near Milan, Italy. We were ordered to search the immediate vicinity and surrounding fields for bodies. We found and carried to an improvised mortuary a good number of these, and I must admit, frankly, the shock of it was to find that these dead were women rather than men. A munitions factory. In those days, women had not yet commenced to wear their hair cut short, as they did later for several years in Europe and America. And the most disturbing thing, perhaps because it was the most unaccustomed, was the presence, and even more disturbing, the occasional absence of this long hair. I remember that after we had searched quite thoroughly for the complete dead, we collected fragments. Many of these were detached from a heavy barbed wire fence which had surrounded the position of the factory, and from the still existent portions of which we picked many of these detached bits. The picking up of the fragments was an extraordinary business, it being amazing that the human body should be blown into pieces which exploded along no anatomical lines, but rather divided as capriciously as the fragmentation in the burst of a high explosive shell. So that's what Hemingway's seeing at the age of 18 on the Italian front as the first American officially involved in World War I as a soldier. Let me just take a quick drink here. While I'm pausing, let's just take a look. There's Hemingway in 1917. Picture taken in Chicago, probably a graduation picture. There's Hemingway in the period we've just been reading about, 1918 in Milan. Can't quite name what's in that face, but see, there's a little fear in that face, don't you think? And there's a little resolution in that face. And there seems to be an awareness of the seriousness of the operation that he's about to embark on as a young man. It's his passport photo from 1921. his marriage in 1921. Hadley Richardson from St. Louis, Missouri. Significantly older than Hemingway, 9 years older. In the Alps on a ski trip. And we've seen this already, and there's Hemingway's friend Sylvia Beach at Shakespeare and Company, where Hemingway was a regular. And there he is. We've seen this already as well. Sylvia Beach tending toward the wound in his head. That's not a war wound. I think I mentioned this earlier. And Adrienne Monnier and a friend. That's Monnier on the far left. And there's Hemingway in Pamplona with his crew, which is the trip that our Hemingway work, The Sun Also Rises, is based on. And there's Gertrude Stein. I think we've seen this already as well with Bumby, Ernest and Hadley's first child, and that's in Paris. Looks like the Garden of Luxembourg. You can tell by the chairs, famous Garden of Luxembourg chairs. There's Hadley and Ernest in 1926. So Hemingway there is, 26 years old, 27 years old. Okay. Let me continue here. So he volunteers for a chain of canteens for soldiers right at the front. And his duty there at the front is to bicycle up to the front twice a day and pass out cigarettes and chocolates directly to the troops. So he's a very young man, and he's also a foreign national. So he's not deployed as a soldier, as a fighter per se, but he is officially, he's in the army doing, I might add, performing a very vital task to the effort. He's stationed near the Piave River Valley, north of Venice, and he's wounded on July 8th in 1918. Pardon me. He receives the Silver Medal of Military Valor from the Italian government. And he's hospitalized in Milan, and he falls in love with a nurse. I'm looking at her name here. I'm not sure if I remembered to write her name or type her name in. I think I did, but her name is Agnes von Kurowski. Von Kurowski, Agnes von Kurowski, Kurowsky, Kurowsky, Agnes von Kurowski. And they fall in love and have a full-on romantic encounter. There are great pictures, pictures I couldn't find for our slideshow. Great pictures of Hemingway with a cape and crutches. See if I can put together a couple of those for us during this period. Okay, well, after the war, he returns to the USA and works as a writer and an editor in Chicago in 1920. Okay, so he's 21 years old, and he works at a small monthly called the Cooperative Commonwealth, the Cooperative Commonwealth. And through a friend, he meets the writer Sherwood Anderson. the guy who wrote Winesburg, Ohio. If you haven't read Winesburg, Ohio, it's a wonderful, important book from the early 20th century. And he meets him in the winter of 1920. And Anderson really likes him. And he invites him out to Palos Park, Palos, Palos Park, which is where the part of Chicago where he lives, for visits and literary discussion. And it's likely that Anderson spoke to Hemingway of the experimentation of Gertrude Stein, right? And that's how Hemingway first came into contact with what was happening in Paris artistically. Anderson takes a trip to Europe in the spring of 1921, and he talks to Hemingway upon his return. And he talks about, this is Sherwood Anderson, talks about how Paris is the place for a young writer. Let me just read a little bit more from Lynn here on this. In all likelihood, Hemingway also heard the older writer speak in praise of Gertrude Stein. In the beginning, Anderson had scorned her work for reasons that we understand. Because if you don't understand what she's doing experimentally, it's a very difficult work to encounter. In the beginning, Anderson had scorned her work, some said, but if so, he had quickly changed his mind. Her drastically simple syntax and diction demonstrated that the demolition of traditional literary language could be carried even further than Mark Twain had dreamed, while her trick of repeating certain key words opened up new means of communicating emotion. Her trick of repeating certain key words opened up a new means of communicating emotion. As Anderson often emphasized, possibly in conversations with Hemingway as well, Miss Stein was a wholesome cook, working in, quote unquote, a kitchen of words. So Hemingway encounters Stein and her ideas through Anderson at first. It's quite likely. There's no absolute proof of this, but it's quite likely that was the case. Okay. Well, Hemingway marries. She was born in St. Louis, Missouri, as I said, in 1891. So she's 8 years older than Hemingway. Did I say 9? She's 8 years older than Hemingway. And Hemingway is 21 years old at the time of the marriage to a woman who's 8 years older. We're not going to be able to do all, we're not going to be able to, I'm just going to do Hemingway up till the time of The Sun Also Rises biographically. But this is, it's a first step that's not without its significance later on. He marries a woman who's 8 years older at the age of 21. Having been through what he's been through as an 18-year-old, I think of him picking the little chunks of dead women out of the ruined fence all afternoon. And they live largely off of Hadley's trust fund. She's extremely wealthy, while occasionally writing, and Hemingway occasionally writes an article for the Toronto Star Weekly. You probably even, if you know anything about Hemingway at all, he wrote for the Toronto paper. And he convinces an editor named John Bone to make him the Star's first European correspondent. So he talks his way back to Europe. And he'll receive $75 a week plus expenses when he's on an assignment, travel, right? And a penny per word for every unassigned piece the paper accepted. So a penny per word for every unassigned piece the paper accepted. So he's on assignment. He gets $75 a week for writing what they tell him to write, right? Which he does so happily. And then he gets a penny a word for everything in addition that he contributes on his own, so to speak. And his the travel expenses are covered. Anderson generously offers letters of introduction to friends he had made during his European visit. So Anderson writes him letters of introduction. What an extremely generous act on the part of this older, more established, indeed famous, because of Winesburg, Ohio, writer. He writes letters of introduction to Sylvia Beach, Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, and Ezra Pound. Not a bad little sheaf of letters to be carrying along with you, around with you as a young person sailing to Paris for the first time. So the Hemingways, both of them, Hadley and Ernest, they set sail on the Leopoldina, and arrive at Le Havre, the port city in France, Le Havre, Harvre, Le Havre, for 4 days before Christmas in 1921. So this is a kind of European honeymoon, right? So post-war Paris was an extraordinary place. You can imagine that without going too far into it, the devastating social and economic and cultural effect of the war impacting, arguably the most significant city in Europe. I'm certainly one of them, significant capitals of Europe. The conditions there were very favorable, ironically, for expatriates, and you can anticipate why. There was severe inflation, right? So there were 1.5 million dead in the war. 1.5 million people died in the war. 10.5% of the productive population of the city. 10.5% of the productive population of the city. And the result was a very favorable exchange rate for foreign currencies. Okay, so the dollar went really far in Paris at the time because of the inflation caused by the war. Secondly, this inflation motivated continued rent control. So landlords, so the government came out with rent control statutes to control the price of rental property, right? Well, landlords, so that's good for visitors and also and for citizens. The landlords responded, landlords angry at this, and also poor, frankly. The landlords responded with ignoring upkeep and facilities. But so things were shabby, dirty, falling apart in some cases. We've seen that in the Bateau Lavoir with Picasso. That's later than the early Cubist period, but the shabbiness continues. So bad for the residents because the landlords either were unwilling to or were unable to keep up the places financially, right? But foreigners could afford help because the dollar went so far. So Hemingway and Hadley settle in at a temporary hotel on the Rue Jacob. And when you go to Paris, you can go to see all these different sites. The great majority of them are still there. You can see the Rue Jacob, right perpendicular to the Rue Bonaparte, just north of the Garden of Luxembourg and west in the Saint-Germain section of Paris. Now very affluent, but then very affordable. That's recommended by Anderson. So Anderson actually recommends the hotel where he stays temporarily. And then they get a 2-room apartment on the 4th floor at 74 Rue du Cardinal Lemoine, 74 Rue du Cardinal Lemoine. And it's right next to the Place de la Contrescarpe. Again, you can go see this in Paris. It's a great walk up the Rue Cardinal Lemoine to the Place Contrescarpe. And you can, you can see there are still brilliant cafes on the Place Contrescarpe. different, but you can imagine what it must have been like, in 1921. And then you can also see Hemingway's apartment, Hemingway and Hadley's apartment, which was just about a block from the square itself, from the place itself, several stories up, four floors up, and there's a plaque, of course, outside the apartment. It's really cool to be able to see this. And right next door is a bal musette, which is a dance club right down the street from the Place Contrescarpe. So there's dancing music going on all night in some cases. Pardon me, allergies. And he meets Sylvia Beach at Shakespeare and Company. I should actually read that encounter because it's a great one. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it here. Let me see if I can. I might have just missed it earlier. I know, riveting, right? Yeah, here we go. Anderson, for his part, considered Hemingway, quote, a young fellow of extraordinary talent who was, quote, instinctively in touch with everything worthwhile going on. He liked to be in the young man's company as much as the young man liked to be in his, and he easily fell into the habit of inviting him out to his little house in suburban Palos Park. So that's back in Chicago. In the spring of 21, however, their meetings temporarily came to a halt when Anderson and his wife went off to Europe as the guests of his literary admirer, Paul Rosenfield. During his absence from Chicago, he was not a good correspondent, so it was not until he returned that Hemingway learned of his fortunate encounter with an American woman named Sylvia Beach, the owner of a Paris bookshop called Shakespeare and Company, who had kindly introduced him to a number of writers, including Gertrude Stein and James Joyce. Paris, Anderson told him, was where the future of literature was being forged and where Hemingway ought to be. Okay, so that's Anderson's introduction. I'm sorry, I thought I had something on the actual meeting. Yeah, not only was Rue Jacob full of interesting Americans, but it was an easy walk from there to the hearth and home of literary Americans in Paris, Sylvia Beach's bookshop in the Rue de l'Odéon. If Hemingway wanted him to go, Anderson would be glad to write letters of introduction for him to Miss Beach, Gertrude Stein, and James Joyce, as well as Ezra Pound, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, there's just a nice little, yeah, here's, yeah, describing Sylvia Beach, quote unquote, no one that I ever knew was nicer to me, Hemingway said of Sylvia in A Movable Feast. And over the years, he was consistently nice to her in return, and so on. We'll talk more about this. Okay. So he meets Sylvia Beach, and she's she's a gay. He begins to attend. He begins to frequent Shakespeare and Company, which is a lending library. I've described that to y'all already. And we have a list of some of the, we actually have the signed slips that you would fill out after when you were taking a book out, right? Remember I mentioned you pay to be able to do this. You'd subscribe and then be able to take out as many books as you wanted. Turgenev's, the Russian writer, Turgenev's Sportsman's Sketches, D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, Dostoevsky's The Gambler, and other stories. And at Shakespeare and Company, of course, Hemingway meets Joyce and Pound. Hemingway writes to Anderson, he calls Joyce's Ulysses, quote unquote, a most goddamn wonderful book. And on Joyce, Hemingway says to Anderson, quote unquote, the greatest writer in the world. It's interesting though, but in the copy, he was presented a copy of Ulysses by Sylvia Beach for reasons I'll mention in a second. It's in the Kennedy Library right now in Boston. You can go see it if you ever want to do any research on Joyce. But only in Hemingway's copy, only the pages of the first half of the book and the Molly soliloquy, which is at the very end of the book, were cut. So in the old days, you actually, when you bought a book, a hardback book, you'd have to actually take a letter opener and cut open the pages because of the way the pages were folded during the printing process. You'd actually have to cut out the ends of the page. It must have been a kind of a cool ritual for a book owner. A big chunk of the middle of Ulysses, the pages had never been cut, so he'd never read the middle. It's a tough go. I mean, I sympathize with him as a young man. Ulysses is a tough go in places, for somebody who's not Catholic and somebody who's not Irish, somebody that may not know much in the way of Latin. It's a tough read today in some ways too, but it's a very rewarding read. Okay, speaking of Ulysses, Ulysses, which was published in 1922, right? So this is right when Hemingway is in Paris, was published by Sylvia Beach in 1922. And Hemingway had a friend whose name was Barney Braverman. I love the name, wonderful name, Barney Braverman. And pardon me, Barney Braverman commuted daily from Detroit to Windsor, Ontario, right across the border, right? And Ulysses was unknown in Detroit. But of course, it had been declared nationally, it had been declared obscene. So it was officially illegal to import Ulysses into the United States. A publisher could not do that on their own, right? So what do you do if you're Joyce wanting to get copies of your absolutely magisterial work, Ulysses, not only into the hands of buyers in American bookstores, but also into the hands of reviewers in America. Maybe more importantly, the reviewers who would then read it, do their review, and then and sell books to people, just like what happens today. Well, how do you get around this? Well, Hemingway had this buddy, Barney Braverman, who does this commute from Detroit to Windsor, Ontario. And Braverman rented a room in Windsor. So he actually stayed over in Windsor, I suppose, during the week, and then came back over to Detroit on weekends. And they mailed him in Canada 40 copies of the book, right? Several boxes or in a crate. And he smuggles them across on the ferry one by one. And then he mails them from within the US to Washington Square Bookshop in New York, to the publisher Alfred Knopf, and to Sherwood Anderson, and many other reviewers and many other publishers. So Hemingway was an absolutely crucial component in getting Ulysses published in getting Ulysses published in or accepted by American publishing companies, and then read by critics, and eventually published in the States. He was a hugely important figure for Joyce. He remained a friend of Joyce for quite some time, and also a friend of Sylvia Beach, who he never had a bad word to say about. Okay, I'm going to actually cut off this well, let's just call this part one of the Hemingway talk. I'm going to cut off the recording right now, and I'll get back to you with Hemingway part two a little bit later. I'm feeling that my allergies are killing me, so I'm going to drink some water, have a little food, and get back to you. Okay, I'll be back with part two. Thank you.